Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Max Bernier Show. Today, I have the privilege to have with me Dr. Julie Ponesse. Julie, thank you for being back with us. And since our last discussion, a lot of things happen here in Canada about the lockdowns and COVID-19 and maybe also a vaccine passport that can be imposed here in Canada. What is your thought about all that?
Ooh, my one thought, about all of that. I think it's probably worth starting by saying that I think a lot of Canadians as individuals, certainly the ones I speak with, and also in a collective sense, there's a kind of COVID fatigue. We've been undergoing this constant barrage of information and fear for 16, 17 months now. And I think it's breaking down, people's sense of trust in their own reasoning abilities, their social relationships, and their trust and confidence about what their security as a citizen is going to look like in the future. And I think we're actually in a kind of dark ages in terms, well, I never thought I would say that of Canada. I never thought that would be something that would be part of our future. As someone who's born in the 70s, I never thought that would be possible. But I think it's really a kind of dark ages because there's an incredible limitation on and suppression of a diversity of voices in the scientific community that is very much at the root of so many of the problems that we're seeing now. And these voices that are being suppressed are labeled as, misinformers or conspiracy theorists, and they're being debunked and fact-checked, and nobody wants those labels. And when labeled, many of those people, think of Dr. Charles Hoff or Dr. Christian or Dr. Patrick Phillips or many, many members of the Canadian COVID Care Alliance that I'm part of, many academics that I know, many physicians practicing that I know. Nobody wants to be labeled and ostracized by the important social and professional groups to which they belong. But unfortunately, the cost of that, the threat of that, is that we are, in a position where apparently we have one scientific voice, and it's a voice that we hear over and over and over again from our government, from Health Canada, from our federal, provincial, municipal governments, and there's almost a complete devoid of evidence being provided for the claims and that they're making, and for the now possibly quite restrictive mandates that we're seeing. And two that are really important and really on the horizon. One, mandates for various schools, and so I'm an instructor at university, and so the vaccine mandates for residents and also for other activities at university. So Seneca College now has in-person mandate and mandate for faculty and staff on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we're seeing vaccine passports possibly implemented in various ways in provinces, and this is a real problem. This is going to be a serious violation of bodily autonomy, informed consent, which is undermined any time we see an instruction or a mandate coerced as opposed to trying to convince someone on the basis of good evidence. We're going to see a freedom of movement, a freedom of association, and I think a state monitoring and possibly also ownership of citizens' bodies. And so we're on a real slippery slope, I think, where we're going to see a stratification of society, a class system, a case system, and it's going to require as I've said before in other interviews, more moral courage than those of us who question these mandates than at any other time before. And if people are watching and they're thinking, well, hold on here, don't we have vaccination cards for schools? Haven't we had that in the past? Yes, we have. The big difference here is that all of the COVID shots in Canada, and I want to be really clear about this because the more that I talk to people, the more confusion I think there is about this. All of the COVID shots on the market, all the ones that have been given out so far, are brought to Canada authorized under an interim order. And in the States, it's an emergency use authorization. And emergency use authorization products, including vaccinations, cannot be mandated. It's against our rights, our healthcare rights. So what we're seeing now is undue disadvantage being imposed on us on the basis of illegal government and, unfortunately, educational institution action. I don't think there's
Illegal
a
and
better way to look at it.
yeah, yeah, illegal and unconstitutional. You're absolutely right.
Yeah,
And the censorship is everywhere. For me, as a
everywhere.
politician, I'm not able to have interview with the mainstream media. We need to do our traveling across the country, be on social media. And but it's worse for you as experts. And we, like I said previously, it's the beginning of a kind of a life that people had in a communist country. And these vaccine passport, when I was speaking against that early, maybe 10 months ago, people were looking at me, oh, Maxime, no, it won't happen. Now, for example, here in Quebec, they said in the beginning of the summer, if 90% of the population have the 2 doses, and if we have a lot of cases, we may be in a position to impose a vaccine passport in Quebec. And now they changed, and they said, oh, we need to have 90% of the population. And if we don't have 90% of the population with double doses, we will impose a vaccine passport. So there's no question about the number of cases anymore. And they will have the tiny minority, myself and the 10% of the population. It will be easy for the government to violate our rights and saying that we are marginal and we won't have the same rights as other citizens vaccinated. So it's very scary. And you had a point about that. But at school, you're saying that they're looking also to impose that, to be sure that every children will be vaccinated. But for me, showing your vaccine passport or the fact that you received the 2 doses must be against our privacy or also,
Yeah, there are multiple problems here. I mentioned that a product under emergency use authorization or interim order can't be mandated. That's a big problem, right? So these mandates never should have gotten off the ground to begin with, and that's why we're seeing legal challenges to them. And I can talk more about that in a minute. Secondly, we have in Ontario anyway, and I think you've mentioned before that there's a Quebec equivalent of this, but we have a sort of a Personal Health Information Protection Act. Mm-hmm. And one of the stipulations of that act is that your personal health information cannot be released without your consent. So vaccine mandates and vaccine passports really can't proceed without a violation of your personal health information, unless you are willing to give it up voluntarily, right? And that's a totally different story. I don't think that, myself, members of the CCCA, we're not saying that people shouldn't have a right to have access to these injections. But it would be just like deciding voluntarily to participate in any other drug trial. What we're objecting to, the worry here, is imposing it on citizens, especially when they don't have full information that would constitute informed consent, right? So a violation of the Personal Health Information Protection Act is a huge problem. Also, we have a right to refuse as Canadians any medical intervention, right? Yeah. And so you can't have both, right? You can't have some version of forced vaccination on the one hand and an upholding of that right to bodily autonomy and a right to refuse some kind of medical intervention, right? And we, for a long time in Canada, we have, in some sense, the whole field of bioethics is built on the idea that a person's body is his or her private property. Yeah. And, the abortion debate, the debate about end of life has focused largely on this idea and this kind of moniker, my body, my choice. Mm-hmm. And I think, Canadian law, civil discourse in Canada, medicine, bioethics has all been built over the last 20 or 30 years on this fundamental idea that unless there is some very high evidentiary threshold that some intervention meets, a person should be allowed to do with his or her own body what that person feels feels is right, And someone might say, watching that, well, this is a bit tricky when it comes to public health, because when we're talking about a communicable illness, what you do with your body does affect what I do with my body. But when it comes to the vaccine mandate and vaccine passport issue, if you choose to be vaccinated and that's your choice, you're protected. And it shouldn't matter what anyone else in your vicinity is doing from an immunological point of view. If you choose to remain unvaccinated because you feel that you have good natural or good T cell immunity, then you're protected. And you don't need to know the immune status of anyone else. So vaccine passports, or what we were seeing, I think it was at the Vancouver airport earlier this week, that we had vaccinated and unvaccinated lines, which I think has been rescinded now, if I read correctly. But anyway, that was in place, right? It's unfounded from a scientific, immunological, legal, and ethical point of view. It's unnecessary. It's also costly to impose these, managerial changes, and they're unnecessary, unfounded.
Yeah, and also I know that the airport, international airport, Pearson Airport in Toronto, they said that they're ready to impose that also, two kind of lines, one for the vaccinated and other one for the unvaccinated. That's the beginning of a show me your papers society, like I said, and it's a kind of a communist country. And the data and the statistics are on our side. When I'm saying that, it's, they are forcing now in Quebec young people to under 18 years old to have the 2 doses, when we know with the statistic here in Canada that, if they have COVID-19, they won't die. The statistic is very clear. They won't die from that. And they have more chances of dying from the traditional flu season than COVID-19. And they're pushing the vaccine on them. How can we explain that?
It's worth pausing on that for a minute, Maxime, because I think it's important to discuss these statistics and to contextualize them and to emphasize them for people who are watching who might be really afraid, because the message from the government is, don't you love your children? Don't you want to protect your children? Don't you want to protect your elderly loved ones? And therefore you should get your child vaccinated. I think that's the message. So I think it's worth you mentioned that children have a very, very, very low risk of dying. Studies in Canada and the UK have both shown that children have a 99.995% survival rate from COVID, and those who have died have had comorbidities, right? So they already had, most of them, right, already had compromised immune system. Because I think one problem here is, and some of the ads that we've seen over the last year from Health Canada, is that we sort of get the impression that you can just walk out onto the street where there are no people and be struck down by this terribly lethal illness from which there's no possibility of recovering. The evidence doesn't support that. You are also, I don't know if we quite understand why this is, but the nature of children's immune system is such that they do much, much better with this illness. This is a very sad fact, but 5 times the number of children who died from COVID died from drowning in Canada, in the same period. And it's not to minimize the significance of that, but I think it's important to put into context the real risk that COVID poses to children. And when we balance that against, right, and we do kind of a risk analysis and look at the pros and cons and balance that against the risks from these investigational vaccines, and we've seen more deaths from the investigational COVID shots in the last 6 months than for every other vaccine on the market in the last 30 years. We're seeing a particularly high incidence of myocarditis, which is a kind of heart inflammation, especially among young men, right? Okay. And I think the public discourse says that, well, that's unimportant. The risk is very rare. The shots are perfectly safe. Well, if by perfectly safe you mean it isn't possible to suffer one of these vaccine side effects, then that's not true. If by perfectly safe you mean that these risks are worth it in order to protect yourself against COVID, well, that's a decision I think that should be up to individuals to make for themselves, right? But it's really important, I think, that we, and this is true of being a good critical thinker, being a good citizen in general, that when you receive a barrage of information, right? Academics know this, lawyers know this. These are fields in which you just deal with a massive amount of information on a daily basis, like journalists as well, right? You want to slow down, look at that information, realize that it isn't all of equal value. Some have more evidence behind it than others. And you want to be really careful with the very strong claims that are being made in the absence of very good evidence, especially when so much is at stake.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not it's not moral what the government is doing right now. I have the example of Quebec. They're saying to younger people, you will have a chance to win $1 million if you have your 2 doses. And so we have a special lottery for you. When they are using incentives like that, for me, it's not moral. People must be free to decide with the right information, like you said. Now they just want to, be sure that everybody will jump in that train of having the 2 doses when there's no risk, and it's very difficult to fight against that.
One thing, it's very difficult. I mean, I think one thing we really need to be careful about is there's a power imbalance here, right? When your government, when major news outlets in your country, when your healthcare provider, maybe especially your personal physician who's known you for a long time and taking care of you for a long time, when they're telling you, you better do something or else, you put a lot of trust in those people and those institutions. And those people and institutions really need, they're entrusted with your safety, with that extra kind of information and expertise that they have. And I think we're seeing a lack of sort of professional integrity. And there's only so much we can do about that. That's going to take, I mean, in the past, we've seen wars being waged, wars fought on the battlefield, on the land, in the air, in the sea. And now we're seeing wars waged in the media outlets, in private government boardrooms, in social media venues, in families, right? And it's a war of information, and it's a war of coercion, and it's a war of a dissolution of confidence in one's personal intellectual abilities, reasoning abilities. And I think we need to reassert all of that, right? Remember that just because someone who has more degrees than I do, for example, is telling me to do something, but they don't seem to be able to offer any evidence why I should. So as you say, in Quebec, it used to be, well, we won't impose a vaccine passport as long as we can get the cases down. Well, that's at least a certain kind of evidence being offered, right? But now if it's, well, we're going to impose a vaccine passport if we don't see above 90% participation in vaccination, that's no kind of evidence being offered. Yeah. Yeah. And we should really be, I think our radar should really be in tune to the fact that something is going on here, right? There's the government wants vaccination for political reasons and not necessarily just immunological ones. And that's when we have to be really worried. You mentioned earlier, when we see these kind of actions that show your papers as being part of, sort of dictatorships or autocratic states, I hesitate to say, I'm sorry to say, but so much of what we're seeing in Canada now, this kind of stratification of citizens, fear mongering by our governments, this is the early stages of every other state in history we have seen that has degenerated from a democracy or a republic into a kind of autocratic state or a dictatorship. We're seeing the early signs of that. And the people, we need to be on guard for this. We need to be aware so that we prevent sliding into it even further.
And that's why it's very important, the work that you're doing. And you just said in the beginning that you, with other experts, are fighting the governments in court. Can you explain a little bit more about that action?
Yeah, I'd like to let everybody know who's watching that last week, so the Constitutional Rights Center, Rocco Galletti and Amina Shirazi, who is a human rights lawyer, and Rocco Galetti's a constitutional rights lawyer, together with Children's Health Defense, sent notices of liability letters of sorts to Western, McMaster, and Seneca College. And more such letters will be going out to universities this week and in the following week. And I participated in a live press release announcement about this on Monday through Children's Health Defense. And if the letters go without a response, then they will proceed and file legal action. Right. So what what they're hoping and what we're collectively working to do is not just try to address the mandates that are currently in existence, but also to put educational institutions who are entrusted with, the safety, the education, the support of, for many adolescents and minors, we're trying to put them on notice and say, this isn't okay. Right? We're not, not all of us are just going to take it for face value that you have our best interests at heart, right? We have rights as citizens. Adolescents have rights to access education in a free, unencumbered, and sort of in a way in which they're not discriminated. And we're going to bring legal action towards the institution that violates those rights.
That's
and
great.
It's time for that.
Yeah. No, it's you're doing a good work. Also, I know that in Alberta, there's a Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms. They are doing that fight. Actually, they are the one who represented me this week. I had a case in Manitoba. As you know, I was put in jail, handcuffed, and for about 9 hours, just after a political gathering in a park. And I was in court by Zoom teleconference Monday, but it has been postponed until the August the 24th. What I'm seeing there is these authoritarian governments doesn't want to have a decision from a judge, and they always postpone. I believe they don't want to have a negative decision because what we are doing, it's legal, it's constitutional, and they don't want to have a judge saying the opposite, and we will have a precedent. I hope in your case that you'll be able to have an hearing if you don't have any answer from the universities.
Yeah. I hope so too, actually. In some sense, I hope they don't respond so that there's a chance for the legal action to go forward, because I think it's really important, not just that we see that play out in a court of law, but that it gets public attention, because, as we've been discussing today and in our previous chat, that transparency of information, who knew that's something we as Canadians would have to fight for? And that is the biggest thing we have to fight for now, right? So many people have just been shut down and silenced. And the unfortunate cost of that, perception of that in the public, is that we do have scientific transparency, that we do have representative government. And if they're not seeing anything to the contrary, why would people believe otherwise, right? Mm-hmm. And I guess one of the reasons why I like to speak with people like you and to try to speak to Canadians is to give them my perspective, at least, which is that we have nothing like a democracy right now in Canada. We have democratic institutions. We have a charter, for example, right? We have people who are trying to participate democratically by asking questions of their government representatives, and who try to, have open discussions and try to publicize those discussions. We have people who are trying to act as democratic citizens, responsible citizens, but I don't believe we have a well-functioning democracy. And we are going to see probably far worse situations than this COVID one in the future, unless we make a really drastic U-turn and change that and elect the right officials, right? Now, clearly, I think you're one of those, or I wouldn't be talking with you today, right? I honestly think that we would not be in this situation in Canada right now if you had a bigger leadership role, right? So there's my endorsement for people who are watching today. But it's really important, right? It's very important that we elect the right people, and we feel that if nothing else, they're willing to listen to us and talk to us and entertain all opinions, and not just mine because I have a PhD in a position at a university, but someone who runs a bake shop and a gas station and a lab technician and a farmer, and all those people deserve just as much of a voice as I have.
Yeah, and you're right about that. I'm looking at the future, and it's scary. It's always more and more a big government in your day-to-day life, and I don't see the end of that. But the optimistic side is, as you know, this fall we may have an election in Canada, and that will give us, the PPC and myself, to be able to do that debate. And I can tell you that I'll be on the stage against these other leaders for the national debates, and that will be a nice opportunity to bring the other point of view. And I will use that electoral campaign to bring that other point of views to Canadians. And, I'm traveling across the country. We have more and more support, more and more people understand that what is happening in our country is not normal. And I like to say that, there's a common sense out there, but right now, the common sense is not so common these days. And you have to explain the situation, to speak about it, and to show other alternatives. And I believe that we will have a surprise after the next election. But I don't know, but I'll do my best. But we need people like you. We need experts like you. And I want to thank you very much for what you're doing. It's so important for being sure that Canadian citizens will have their rights respected by their government. And like you said, we have a great constitution, but the problem is not our constitution. The problem is the politicians right now that are not governing in line with our constitution, and a lot of their actions are unconstitutional. So, but people must understand that. And what you're doing with other experts, it is an important step. And that's why I like to have the discussion with you. I don't know if you want to add something before we we leave. Yeah.
I just have two thoughts on that. You mentioned we have a constitution, we have politicians who aren't following it. And another way to put that is to say that, it's one thing to have justice, but you also need functional justice, right? You need not just to have just laws and just institutions and just documents, but you need to have just people who implement them judiciously in the right ways, right? Secondly, we were talking about wars and how they've been fought in the past. But if you think about the way that all good wars have been won, the people got together. The people sort of asserted themselves. They collected themselves. They gathered their powers together. You think about the campaign at the beginning of the Second World War, when the British were just terrified that they were going to be obliterated by airstrikes. And so they come out with this campaign that says "Keep calm and carry on." Yeah. We have no such campaign in Canada right now, but we certainly should have one, because what the people need, right, is a reminder that keep calm, keep your head level. Remember, you have the right to talk to whomever you want and associate with whomever you want. And we need strength in numbers. It's wonderful that politicians like you are speaking out. It's wonderful that we have, lawyers like Rocco Galletti and Amina Shirazi bringing these legal actions. But without the support of the people who are writing to their politicians and speaking out, in media outlets, a lot of those individual actions don't have force. And so I hope the people who are watching, please do what you can. I know it feels like a very small thing if it's just you, but you put all of those small things together and you can weave something together that's pretty powerful and undeniable.
Yes, and we must ask them also, they must not let their emotions dominate their actions. I think they must just sit down, relax a little bit, think about all that, use your reason, and the common sense must prevail. And they can do their research, they can look and by themselves, and they will be able to have the other point of view. And after that, decide themselves. That's why, I believe in individual freedom and personal responsibility. People has a certain responsibility to inform themselves concerning COVID-19, because we have only one point of view in the mainstream media. So that's why I'm doing these Max Bernier show, and being able to speak with people like you. So that's I think that for me, that's important. I want to bring the other point of view out there. And I want to thank you again for being part of that.
Thank you very much for doing what you're doing, and I hope you'll keep doing it.
We will. Have a nice day.